Larry Ellison ordered workers to ignore broken safety gear, pushed production for profit, and thought his billions would erase the damage. But Judge Frank Caprio detonated a courtroom verdict that exposed Ellison's secret orders, froze every Vanguard Infrastructure Group project statewide, and publicly crushed a corporate titan in front of a packed courtroom. That morning, the courtroom filled earlier than usual, and the crowd was different. There were no distracted traffic violators or minor disputes waiting their turn. Instead, construction workers in heavy jackets took their seats beside young apprentices who still carried the look of inexperience, and older laborers whose hands had survived decades of hard winters and harder work. They sat close together on the wooden benches, quiet but focused, like a group that had been waiting for this moment. When the clerk, Rosa, placed the file on top of the docket, she paused for a brief second before stepping back. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said enough. This case was different. The name on the folder was simple, but it carried weight. Elias Thorne versus Vanguard Infrastructure Group. Judge Caprio had seen countless lawsuits over the years, yet some cases never felt like routine paperwork. As Caprio adjusted his robe, his thoughts briefly turned to his father, a carpenter who spent his life building with his hands instead of managing companies from high-rise offices. He had always taught one guiding principle: the law is strongest when it protects the voiceless. Looking out at the packed gallery, it was clear why that belief still mattered. The people sitting there weren't searching for spectacle. They were searching for proof. Proof that a human life isn't just another line on a corporate spreadsheet. Then the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a slow creak, and the room shifted instantly. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Larry Ellison stepped inside with the calm, controlled. Behind him, his legal team moved in tight formation, dark suits, tablets in hand, forming a silent wall of authority. This wasn't a local contractor showing up to answer for a job site accident. This was the controlling chairman, the man whose money and influence kept Vanguard Infrastructure standing tall and, for years, protected from real consequences. On the opposite side of the room, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. Elias Thorne sat in a worn wheelchair, its metal frame scratched and dulled from years of use. His hands rested quietly on his lap, thin and trembling, hands that once carried steel beams and lifted his children into the air. Behind him stood his daughter, Sarah, gripping the handles of the chair so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The expired safety harness that failed on the job site had taken more than Elias's ability to walk. It had taken his independence, his career, and the life he had built piece by piece. While Ellison arrived surrounded by power, Elias arrived carrying the weight of everything he had lost. Ellison didn't look at him. Not once. As he reached the defense table, he glanced down at his watch, adjusted his cuff, and leaned slightly toward his lead attorney, whispering something that ended with a faint, confident smirk. It was small, almost subtle, but it landed hard in the silent room. To Ellison, this wasn't a reckoning. It was an appointment, another item on a packed calendar. Judge Caprio noticed it immediately. The posture, the impatience, the quiet arrogance of a man who believed time itself worked for him. When Ellison finally settled into his chair, Caprio leaned forward just enough for his voice to cut clean through the room. "This is not a meeting, Mr. Ellison," he said calmly, without raising his tone. The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They carried weight on their own. Judge Caprio didn't waste time easing into the hearing. He lifted the file, tapped it once against the bench, and locked eyes with Larry Ellison. His voice cut through the room. 3 separate safety inspectors had flagged critical equipment failures weeks before Elias Thorne's fall. Expired harnesses, damaged straps, warnings stamped in bold letters. Caprio asked why production was never stopped, why no emergency replacement was ordered, and why a man was allowed to climb, knowing the gear beneath him was already compromised. But Ellison didn't rise. He leaned back slowly, folded his arms, and answered with the relaxed confidence of someone used to dominating boardrooms. He said he ran a billion-dollar operation, not a toolbox. He didn't track nylon straps or safety tags. That was middle management's job. And if a worker chose to use outdated equipment, that was personal responsibility. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, and Caprio's expression hardened. So you're saying leadership means collecting profits and outsourcing consequences? He fired back. That you get the reward and someone else gets the wheelchair? Ellison's lips curled into a thin smile. He shrugged slightly, as if the question bored him. He said construction was dangerous by nature, that risk came with the paycheck, that everyone who stepped onto a job site knew exactly what they were signing up for. Caprio leaned forward, his hands flat on the bench. So let's be clear, he said sharply. A spinal cord is just a business variable to you? A man losing his legs is just an operational cost? Ellison didn't flinch. His answer came cold and steady. Risk is priced into the job, he said. That's reality. You don't build cities by being sentimental. The room reacted instantly. Workers shifted in their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Sarah's grip tightened around her father's wheelchair so hard her arms trembled. Caprio stared at Ellison for a long second, then spoke again, slower this time. That wasn't legal language, he said. That was your real belief. And now it's on record. Ellison tried to recover control, lifting his chin and adjusting his cuff as if resetting his posture would reset the moment. He added that Vanguard infrastructure created thousands of jobs, paid massive taxes, and fueled the economy. Caprio didn't let him finish. Don't hide behind job numbers, he snapped. A paycheck doesn't cancel out a shattered spine. Ellison's smile faded, replaced by a tight jaw. He muttered that the court was turning business reality into emotional theater. Caprio answered immediately. No, Mr. Ellison. You turned human lives into spreadsheets. This court is just forcing you to look at the human cost you tried to bury. Then Caprio delivered the next blow. He announced the court would hear from a safety inspector next, someone who documented the warnings Vanguard infrastructure ignored, someone who couldn't be dismissed as emotional or inexperienced. The room went quiet again. But this time it wasn't tension alone. It was anticipation. The bailiff called the next witness, and a man in a faded gray jacket stepped toward the stand, carrying a thin folder pressed tight against his chest. He introduced himself as a senior safety inspector assigned to the West End project. And from the first sentence, it was clear he hadn't come to protect anyone's image. He explained that his team had flagged the site 3 separate times before Elias Thorne's fall. Harnesses showed visible UV damage from long exposure. The webbing was frayed near load-bearing points, expiration tags had been ignored, and equipment logs were incomplete or missing entirely. Each inspection ended with the same written recommendation: halt production until replacements arrived. He looked straight at the bench and said the danger wasn't theoretical. Those harnesses were already failing stress standards, he stated. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. The gallery stirred, and a few workers nodded slowly, recognizing the pattern they had seen too many times on job sites. The defense immediately tried to soften the impact. Ellison's lead attorney stood and argued that inspection reports were advisory, not binding orders. He called them precautionary recommendations, meant to guide site managers, not shut down operations. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He waited until the lawyer finished, then turned back to the inspector with a calm expression that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Let me ask you something simple, Caprio said. If this wasn't serious, if this was just routine paperwork, why did your report use the phrase critical failure in bold letters? The inspector didn't hesitate. He answered that critical failure was only used when equipment posed an immediate risk of catastrophic injury or death. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. That one phrase cut through every legal excuse and landed exactly where it hurt. Larry Ellison shifted in his seat, then leaned forward abruptly, his patience finally cracking. He stared at the inspector with open contempt. You people always exaggerate, he said sharply. Worst-case scenarios, dramatic language, fear tactics. That's how you justify your department's budget. His words hit the room like a slap. Even his own attorney froze for a second, clearly unsure whether to step in or let the comment hang. The inspector's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. He calmly replied that safety reports didn't exist to protect budgets. They existed to keep workers alive. Caprio watched Ellison closely, noting the irritation creeping into his posture, the loss of control slipping through his polished exterior. Then he delivered the next blow with quiet precision. He informed the court that this wasn't the only warning on record. There was also an internal audit, signed by Vanguard Infrastructure's own head of safety, confirming the same failures. When Sarah Thorne was called to the stand, the room shifted again. She stood slowly, barely 20 years old, shoulders tight with responsibility that most people her age never have to carry. The judge noticed her hands before anything else. They were scarred and rough, small burns and cuts layered over each other from endless double shifts at a local diner, all to keep up with hospital bills and prescription costs that never seemed to stop. She walked to the witness chair with her head high, but her eyes carried the weight of exhaustion. This wasn't just testimony for her. It was survival. Every form, every code, every insurance call had become part of her daily life since her father's fall. And now she was being asked to relive it in front of the man whose company had started it all. Her voice shook at first, but it didn't stay weak for long. She told the court who Elias Thorne was before the accident. A man who fixed neighbors' porches for free. A man who carried her on his shoulders when she was little. A man who never missed a shift, never asked for special treatment, never complained. Then she pointed toward the wheelchair without even turning her head. Now, she said, her father apologized every morning for being alive. He apologized for needing help to eat. He apologized for taking up space. The words landed hard. More than one person in the gallery dropped their eyes. Sarah paused for a breath, steadying herself, then continued, saying none of this happened because of bad luck. It happened because someone decided saving money mattered more than replacing broken safety gear. Larry Ellison responded with pure disrespect. He let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, rolled his eyes toward the ceiling, and checked his watch as if the testimony were running past its scheduled time slot. The movement was small, but everyone saw it. Sarah saw it. Her hands tightened at her sides, and instead of breaking down, she did something different. She turned her head and looked straight at him. "Say my father's name," she said clearly. The courtroom froze. Ellison smirked and brushed it off, calling it emotional theater, unnecessary drama. Before Sarah could respond, Judge Caprio stepped in sharply. "In this courtroom, names matter," he said. "You will not reduce a human being to a statistic." Ellison leaned forward, irritation flashing across his face. "Look, kid," he cut in without waiting for permission. "Construction is dangerous. Everyone knows that. We're not a charity. We build projects. Accidents happen." The words hit Sarah like a slap, but she didn't step back. She took a breath and delivered her final blow. She told the court that after the accident, a critical medical equipment request for her father had been denied. The reason listed wasn't lack of medical need. It wasn't missing paperwork. It was company policy from above. The room went silent again. But this time, it wasn't shock alone. It was the sound of something much bigger starting to unravel. Judge Caprio opened a thick folder on the bench and let it rest there for a moment, giving the courtroom just enough time to sense that something heavier was coming. He made it clear these weren't reports from outside activists or angry unions. These were internal safety audits written by Vanguard Infrastructure's own engineers, people on Ellison's payroll whose job was to protect the company from exactly this kind of disaster. One report dated 6 months before Elias Thorne's fall stood out. It warned that multiple harnesses on the West End site had been compromised by long-term sun exposure and material fatigue, and recommended immediate decommissioning. Caprio read the key line aloud, slow and deliberate. "Remove from service immediately." The phrase echoed through the room, and several workers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, knowing exactly how often warnings like that were ignored. Then Caprio lifted a page higher than the rest. At the bottom of the report was a short handwritten note. Only 6 words, but heavy enough to change the tone of the entire hearing. Review next fiscal year. Budget is tight. Caprio held the document up so it was clearly visible and turned his eyes back to Larry Ellison. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" he asked. Ellison didn't answer right away. He straightened his tie, inhaled slowly, and then dismissed it with a practiced calm. He said Vanguard Infrastructure was a massive operation with thousands of internal comments and marginal notes. He couldn't be expected to track every scribble or remark. Construction was inherently risky, he added, and decisions had to be made within financial constraints. Margins mattered. Downtime was expensive. This was the language he knew best. Caprio didn't let him hide behind it. He leaned forward, his voice sharper now. "So let's make this simple," he said. "Is this note false, or is it inconvenient?" The room went quiet again. Ellison tried to pivot back to corporate language, talking about layered approval systems, internal review processes, and operational workflows. Caprio cut him off. "Process is how you hide decisions," he said bluntly. At the end of the chain, a human being decided money mattered more than safety. Ellison's jaw tightened, and his fingers tapped lightly against the table, betraying the first real sign of discomfort. Then Caprio delivered the next warning without revealing the evidence yet. He told the court there was another document tied to this case. Not an audit, not a margin note, but a direct memo pulled from Vanguard Infrastructure's private server. The date on it was 48 hours before Elias Thorne fell. Caprio paused and let that sink in. He didn't read it yet. He didn't show it yet. But the tension in the room spiked instantly, because everyone understood what that timing meant. Elias Thorne had sat in silence for most of the morning, his head slightly lowered, hands resting stiffly in his lap. But when the judge paused and the room settled again, Elias slowly lifted his face. His movement was small, almost hesitant, yet it pulled every pair of eyes toward him. He looked across the courtroom, not at the lawyers, not at the judge, but straight at Larry Ellison. When he spoke, his voice was rough and unsteady, like it hadn't been used much in a long time. "I asked for new gear," he said quietly. The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They landed heavy. Elias swallowed, took another breath, and continued. He told the court that days before the fall, he had warned the site foreman that the harness straps felt brittle and worn. He said he was scared, that he didn't feel safe climbing with that equipment. The foreman's response burned into his memory. "Don't slow production," Elias repeated, his voice tightening. "And if you don't like it, there are 10 men behind you who'll take your spot." A low sound rippled through the gallery, half anger, half disbelief, as workers recognized a sentence they had all heard in different forms. Ellison's legal team reacted immediately. One of his attorneys stood and objected, claiming emotional trauma-distorted memory, that Elias's recollection couldn't be considered reliable. Before the lawyer could finish, Judge Caprio raised his hand sharply. "Sit down," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. He looked directly at Ellison's side of the table. "Trauma doesn't erase details," Caprio continued. "It burns them in. People forget what they had for breakfast. They don't forget the moment their life was taken from them." Elias lowered his eyes again, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling as if each word had cost him something. The room stayed completely still. No shifting, no whispering, no movement at all. Then Caprio straightened in his chair and delivered the next blow with calm precision. He announced that the court would now hear from Vanguard Infrastructure's private server records. He told Ellison's counsel to remain seated and instructed the clerk to prepare the document for reading. The judge paused deliberately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then the clerk handed Judge Caprio a single sheet of paper sealed in a transparent sleeve, and even before he spoke, the color alone drew every eye in the room. It was bright yellow, impossible to ignore, The kind of paper companies use when they want something to stand out and get acted on fast. Caprio held it up slightly, just enough for the front rows to see. The timestamp at the top was clear, 48 hours before Elias Thorne fell. Then he began to read. Do not halt production for equipment inspection. He paused. Every hour of downtime costs $50,000. Another pause, longer this time. If men complain about the harnesses, tell them they are free to quit. The final line cut deepest. The memo carried digital initials tied directly to Larry Ellison's executive authority, routed through Vanguard Infrastructure's internal command system. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a written order. The courtroom didn't go quiet. It went dead. Not a cough, not a chair moving, not even the hum of whispers. Workers in the gallery froze in place, staring forward like they couldn't believe what they had just heard. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up instantly. Elias didn't blink. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked forward, absorbing every word like confirmation of what his body already knew. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room so hard it felt physical, like the air itself had thickened. Ellison reacted in stages, each one more desperate than the last. First came denial. He shook his head sharply and muttered that the document wasn't authentic, that anyone could fabricate a page and slap a logo on it. When that didn't move the room, he shifted to legal attack. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently, then raised his voice to claim the memo was privileged, illegally obtained, and inadmissible. His tone grew louder, sharper, trying to regain control through volume and authority. Caprio didn't flinch. He calmly responded by listing the authentication process. IT chain of custody verification, metadata timestamps matching Vanguard Infrastructure's internal server clock, and routing headers showing the memo passed through Ellison's executive approval channel. With each technical detail, Ellison's face lost more color. By the time Caprio finished, Ellison wasn't arguing anymore. He was sweating. Then it happened. Elias slowly lifted his head and met Ellison's eyes across the room. It wasn't anger in his expression. It was something heavier. Recognition. The truth finally had a face. Ellison tried to hold the stare for a second, then looked away, his posture shrinking, shoulders tightening inward. For the first time since he walked into the courthouse, he didn't look like the man in control. He looked like someone cornered by his own words. Caprio watched the exchange, then spoke again, his voice low and steady. "This isn't about damages anymore," he said. "This is criminal territory." And in that moment, everyone in the room understood that the case had just crossed a line Ellison could never step back over. Then Larry Ellison exploded out of his chair. The sudden movement scraped wood against tile and shattered the frozen silence like glass breaking. He stood tall, straightened his jacket, and pointed toward the bench with a mix of anger and disbelief. He said he had built jobs, paid millions in taxes, funded infrastructure projects that kept cities alive. He called the accident a freak tragedy, an unfortunate chain of events that no executive could reasonably predict. His voice rose with every sentence, as if volume alone could push reality backward. He tried to talk over the room, to dominate it the way he dominated conference calls and shareholder meetings, but the air had already turned against him. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned forward slowly and looked Ellison straight in the eyes. "Character isn't your suit," he said flatly, "and your wealth doesn't rewrite decency." He motioned toward Sarah's hands, still marked with burns and scars from endless shifts. Then he turned toward Elias, sitting motionless in his wheelchair. "That's the cost of your leadership," Caprio continued. "Not your stock price, not your quarterly reports, a young woman working herself into exhaustion, and a father who will never walk again." Ellison tried to interrupt, but Caprio cut him off. "And this memo," he added, tapping the yellow page, "isn't business strategy. It's cruelty with a signature. Ellison fired back, saying workers knew construction was dangerous. That risk was part of the job. Caprio didn't hesitate. "A job isn't a favor," he said sharply. "It's a contract, and your side of that contract included safety." Ellison shook his head, muttering that risk was unavoidable. Caprio's voice dropped, slow and deadly calm. "They knew risk," he said. "They didn't consent to sabotage." The word hung in the air like smoke. Ellison opened his mouth again, but nothing came out this time. His shoulders sagged slightly, and the fight drained from his posture. Finally, Ellison sat back down. Not with confidence. Not with control. He sank into the chair like his body suddenly felt heavier than it had all morning. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. His expensive watch, once checked every few minutes, now sat ignored on his wrist. His hands hovered near his cufflinks, trembling just enough for the front row to notice. The man who had walked in believing he owned the room now looked small inside it. Judge Caprio let the silence stretch one last time before delivering the next blow. He informed the court that an injunction was now on the table, one that could freeze Vanguard Infrastructure's operations across the entire state. Judge Caprio straightened in his chair and began the ruling without ceremony. He ordered maximum civil damages for Elias Thorne, ensuring lifetime medical coverage, full compensation for lost wages, and long-term financial stability for both Elias and Sarah. He made it clear that no hospital bill, mortgage payment, or rehabilitation cost would ever again hang over that family's head. But he didn't stop there. Caprio announced that the case would be formally referred to the district attorney for criminal negligence. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It was a matter of accountability under the law. Then came the part that made the entire courtroom inhale at once. Caprio issued an immediate injunction halting all Vanguard infrastructure projects statewide. Every site, every contract, every crane and scaffold. Operations would remain frozen until independent safety inspections were completed, not paid by the company, but financed directly from Ellison's personal assets as controlling authority. The ripple of shock moved through the gallery like a wave. This wasn't a fine. It was a shutdown. Caprio looked directly at Ellison and repeated the number from the memo. "You said downtime costs $50,000 an hour," he said. "Now your downtime has a name. It's accountability." Ellison didn't argue. He couldn't. His face had gone pale, his eyes unfocused, like someone trying to process the collapse of a world he thought was permanent. When the bailiffs approached, there was no swagger left, no confident stride. He stood slowly and allowed himself to be escorted away, his expensive coat hanging loose on his shoulders. Across the room, Elias and Sarah didn't watch him leave. They looked forward, toward the door, toward something that finally felt like a future instead of a fight. As the courtroom emptied, the meaning of the verdict settled in. This wasn't just about one executive or one company. It was about a system that treated workers as replaceable and safety as optional. That system had been forced to kneel, at least for one day. And when the gavel finally struck, the message was clear and impossible to ignore. Money can buy power, it can buy silence, but it cannot buy the truth. If this story shook you, don't just watch and move on. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case where power gets exposed and truth wins. Share this video with anyone who believes workers deserve protection, not excuses. And remember, when we stand together, even the richest voices can't silence justice.